Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I am here today with Mr. Ken Hackathorn, who has some, well, he would deny it, but he has some extensive firearms experience, and I thought it would be interesting to talk about the M1 Carbine. And there's a lot of contradictory information out there about the M1 Carbine. For example, at least in my experience, I've never actually had an M1 Carbine that ran what I would call reliably. There's always this occasional feed malfunction. You're having to rack the bolt periodically. And yet the M1 Carbine has this tremendous reputation from World War II and Korea and Vietnam. They're very popular guns worldwide. You know, the U.S. made more of these things than literally any other firearm during World War II. So what is the explanation for how it can kind of have these two natures?
Well, I think, again, we have to put things in a historical context. And you're right. I mean, there are two groups of people, those people that like the M1 Carbine and those people who think it's a terrible platform. And it's kind of an interesting firearm in the sense that, for example, design-wise, in many ways, it was the original PDW.
Right. Yep.
Original. That was the concept. Yet, interestingly enough, we made over 6 million of them in World War II, more than any other small arm. Mm-hmm. So they were obviously widely used. And it's interesting. And one of the things I've had the pleasure in my lifetime is to talk to and interview a lot of World War II vets, Korean vets, and so forth. And one of the things I tell people, when you talk to a World War II vet, and I grew up in a generation where my dad was a World War II vet, most everybody I knew, uncles, brothers, fathers, somebody was in World War II. And when you talk to them about the M1 Carbine, the guys that actually carried and used them generally spoke very highly of them. Even though it was designed as a gun you give to cooks and clerks and support people, obviously a lot of them were used in combat.
Right. Well, it's a tremendously light gun.
Oh, yeah.
This thing is fantastic to carry. I'm really of two minds. It annoys me that I can't ever get one that seems to work right, and yet I wish I could because it's such a cool
part of the
gun.
thing I tell people with the carbine, remember, this reflects the manufacturing technology of that era. Mm-hmm. One of the major issues with the carbine was that it was built around a cartridge that basically Americans had to rethink the way they did. For example, due to the tappet gas system and it's enclosed, it's the only firearm in World War II that used a non-corrosive ammunition.
Right.
Because if they'd used corrosive, the system would cease to work pretty quickly.
Right. There's no way to clean in the gas system.
There were some design problems with it. For example, the magazine, the original 15-round box magazine, but this, even look at a 30. If you look at it, this is the worst flimsy piece of junk we ever issued in a box magazine. And for those of us who've been around it and seen how the magazine can be a flawed design, which results in probably more stoppages than most people would like to admit. When you talk to World War II vets, and I remember the first time I heard it, I was somewhat taken aback, and I said to the guy, well, what firearm did you carry? And this guy had served in Europe, and he said, I carried an M1 Carbine, which kind of shocked me because I expected him to say an M1. I said, what do you think of it? He said, I loved it. It was a great firearm. And I talked about it, and he said, in one of the comments, he brought it up, I didn't. He just said, well, you know, what we did about every week is replace the magazines. And I was like, the light went on like, well, he said, yeah, the magazines are pretty much junk. And he said, so every time we had a break or a chance and you got new magazines, we just threw the old ones away. And we put new magazines in guns, and they work great.
Okay.
And and the guy said, look, remember, one thing about the U.S. Army, there is always support gear that followed us. He said, there was never a shortage of ammo or anything you needed. It was there. He said, so we just standard issue. Somebody go draw ammunition, and when they did, they always got a box of magazines, and they came wrapped in like wax paper, and you just peeled them off, loaded them up, and that's the way you ran it. You didn't pick up the carbine magazines. You didn't really make it much of an effort to save them. You just understood that they were basically expendable. Okay. Well, when you look at it from that approach, it changes things a bit.
That really does, yeah.
The other thing, if you're a gun guy like you are, and you look at the design of guns, there's some things. For example, when you take it apart and you look at the recoil spring, the thing that powers the bolt mechanism, when you look at that,
there's not much of it there.
It's like, well, so today's carbines, those of us that are military collectors, you've got a gun that's got a spring that's 70 years old. Yep. Spring technology in wartime was probably not what it could have been. And so that's why most people shoot a World War II carbine, era carbine today, and they go, man, these things aren't very reliable. Call Wolf, get a new recoil spring, put it in your gun. And by the way, you've got to lubricate this gun. If it's running dry, it's not going to run well.
Okay.
They have to be run wet. You do that, then the reliability goes up. But having said that, America accepted a level of reliability that was at a different standard than we are today.
Okay. I was suspecting you were going to say that.
And I think it was what everybody had, it's what everybody used, and if they choked and misfed, and generally the stoppage you would get is a failure to feed, almost always. Not a failure to eject or extract, but a failure to feed. And a lot of times just hitting the bolt would close it, or you cycle it, kick that one, and start it again. I think that was just part of the way the world was. But I can tell you, the original guns, I remember when the DCM guns were released back in the 1960s. And by the way, through the NRA, you could buy an M1 Carbine through the Director of Civilian Marketing. They were $20. I still have mine, by the way, my $20 carbine.
Nice.
But we never saw many stoppage. Those guns were fairly fresh. And most of them, by the way, had all been arsenal rebuilt, just like this gun. Basically, they've all been arsenal reconditioned, because the U.S. military, even today, they never cared about collectability. They cared about function guns. So they were rebuilt. Sure. And most of them had replacement parts, and they ran well. As long as you kept them lubed, shot quality ammo, carbine worked out really well. And think about it. After World War II, we gave M1 carbines
like everybody.
To everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, Mexico military was armed with. I mean, the Bundeswehr started off again with M1 carbines. They were worldwide, and they probably would not have lasted or been that popular had they been really that flawed. I thought it was an interesting deal. I was talking to a guy when I was training in Luxembourg, and he had a collection, World War II collection. It was awesome. Basically, these were battlefield pickup stuff. But it was interesting. His grandfather had a farm near Dietrich, Luxembourg. And as the Germans pushed through on the Battle of the Bulge, when they basically made the punch through, they captured huge amounts of Americans, as you can imagine. And his grandfather's farm, where the Germans made their internment camp, in a big Constantine area, and that's with the American prisoners. The captured weapons were dumped in his grandfather's front yards. There'd be piles of M1 Grands, piles of 03 Springfields, piles of M1 Carbines, piles of grease gun. I mean, everything imaginable would be in the pile. And he told me something interesting. He said that of all the U.S. weapons that were in that pile in his grandfather's front yard, the one gun that the Germans came and raided, the first ones they took with bandoliers ammo, were M1 carbines.
Okay.
They didn't take any other American small arms, but they were really fond of the carbine.
I'd have been a little surprised they weren't taking M1s as well.
No, carbines. And he said so, and by the way, his collection was superb, because at night, his grandfather would sneak out and get these guns and hide them in the barn. So that's why he had this great collection of small arms.
Nice.
And it's interesting, he said about, whenever the turn came and the Americans are now pushing the Germans back, they used his grandfather's farm as an internment center for captured Germans.
Okay.
And it was German small arms and equipment packed in the front yard. And he said, it's interesting, when the Americans raided it for loot or for souvenirs, it was German pistols.
Okay.
That was depleted every day. They weren't interested in any other German small arm. He said a lot of Americans were intrigued with the Sturmgewehr, but there was no ammo supply for it. And they were smart to realize that this probably wasn't going to be a good choice, because you couldn't count on replenishing your ammunition. Another thing he told me is interesting about the MP44 is, just as a side note, is that the Germans quickly learned that if you load the magazine with 30 rounds, they didn't work very well. They generally download them to 25 or 26 rounds, and they work great. But
I've actually had that experience myself with the original.
But the carbine, I think, has been, and again, you have other people say, well, the carbine's worthless, it doesn't have any power. And compared to an M1 Garand, it's not the same gun. But if you look at the mission this was designed for, this was to be a replacement for the 1911 pistol. Right. It was never designed to be a primary combat arm. But overall, it is not as bad a gun as people sometimes think it is.
If I remember, I should have looked this up, but the numbers I remember seeing on that was it 100 or 200 yards, the carbine has as much energy as a 357 point blank. That's not trivial.
Yeah, so... Yeah. But if you look at the round, remember, and another thing that historically people tend to sit around and say, well, I want a rifle that's got a 600-yard capability.
Oh, that's nonsense.
Cool. But in the real world, most combat is 150 yards and less as far as effective hits. And I always tell people, guys say, well, I want a gun that I can engage an enemy target or I can hit a target at 800 yards on a rifle range, a nice sterile rifle range where you can go prone, which is hard to do in the real world because of terrain issues. But the main thing is nobody's shooting back at you.
Right.
When somebody's shooting at you, everything changes. 150 yards is a long shot when people are shooting at you. But I tell people, for 100 yards and under, it's actually not a bad tool. Again, I've talked to a number of vets that use these, and as far as if you could shoot, if you were a competent rifleman, and again, we sometimes misunderstand that not everybody that is issued a small arm is a good shooter.
That's putting it mildly, I suspect.
Yeah. But the guys that could shoot, that used the carbine, quite often were perfectly satisfied with it.
Okay. How much do you think the commercial reproduction guns have damaged the reputation of the carbine?
Tremendously.
Okay.
Tremendously. I don't know. Starting in the 60s, when the demand for these was so high, the first company came out, I think, there was Plainfield, Universal, and those guns, none of them worked right.
Now, Universal, I would think, made an improvement in going to a dual recoil spring.
Oh, yeah. I think there were some design improvements, but the quality of the guns never, they were just terribly unreliable guns. And that kind of carries through to today, some of the vendors. I look at some of the inland guns, and they're cool, good-looking guns. I know a few people bought them, and out of the box, they don't appear to be always as reliable as we would hope.
My own personal experience with a new inland was not great.
Again, I've got some original ones. I've got a soft spot in my heart for them because I grew up with them. And when I was a 18-year-old, this was the AR-15 of my generation. This was the assault rifle.
Okay,
because
that makes
you bought
sense.
them.
Yeah.
You got them at the DCM. They were $20. You got a bunch of 30-round magazines. And, man, ammunition was inexpensive. This was the cool guy gun. So times have changed, but at that point in America, everybody had an M1 Carbine. It was often the police standard. I can remember during the era when the Cuban rebels, the ones that were opposing Castro, they're all planning to go back and take over that, and the demand for carbines were huge. One of the reasons that the aftermarket carbine manufacturer started was to arm those guys. Most people don't know that. The Universal, which was made down in Florida, was kind of funded by, we got to make carbines so all these Cubans can go back to Cuba and run Fidel and his crowd out. So
interesting.
And then you look at, for example, experience with the Koreans. The Koreans used this gun for a long time, rebuilt them extensively. The Japanese military was armed with them. They actually even made their own M1 carbine for a while for export use. And their own use. Yeah, most people know that. Yeah, actually, there are actual Japanese-made M1 carbines. In Europe, numerous countries are armed with them after World War II.
Yeah.
Basically, the Vietnamese army, at the beginning of the Vietnam conflict, they all carried M1 carbines. It was a perfect size gun for them. So, hell, the Viet Cong used them in huge numbers. So, it's an interesting firearm that has a mixed message among today's guys because basically they're taking guns often that are quite honestly worn out.
Yeah, well, 75
and not
years
well
old.
maintained. And they say, well, they don't work real well. Actually, a good one does, but the standard we accept for reliability today is probably different than it was in World War II.
Yeah, that has definitely changed.
Yeah, and I tell a lot of people, they updated to the M2. The concept was, let's make it full automatic. In many ways, this was our answer to the MP44. Probably flawed. Cyclic rate was too high for the gun.
Okay.
Bolt fractures were real common. As a matter of fact, they upgraded to the full round bolt. The flat bolts were famous for breaking.
Okay.
And not a good thing when you're in the middle of it.
Not so much, no.
One of the items I tell people that most people have never had a chance to try, if you've ever shot an M2 carbine, they're kind of unique. Actually, not easy to control. But they developed a muzzle brake for the M2. Most people have never shot it. By the way, you put that on an M2, it changes the gun dramatically.
Really?
So there's a case for a muzzle brake compensator. And if you look at the design, you go, you look at things like the AK-74 and some other designs, you go, maybe that concept isn't terribly new.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never had the chance to try out one of those brakes.
You will be amazed when you shoot it. You'll say, wow, that's a big change.
I didn't find the M2 standard to be all that bad. I'd heard a lot of people saying they're really hard to control.
Well, if you watch the average guy, again, you're a pretty talented shooter, Ian.
Well, I do have more experience with full auto than a lot of people.
But if you hand this gun to the average guy and flip the switch to automatic, it's not real pretty.
Okay. All right.
But again, I'm probably not as negative about the carbine. One of the drawbacks by today's standards is very difficult to mount on optic.
Yes.
Although my original DCM carbine, I still have, it's an inland, has got a Ultimac handguard on it,
Ultimac
and
does
I got
do
an
that.
8-point micro on it. I call it an old guy's. So, by the way, it's cool. It works great.
I bet it is, yeah. What do you think about the upgraded sights and the bayonet load? I've always kind of figured if I was going to get an M1 carbine, I kind of want the original one.
The trouble with the early L sights is they aren't always zeroed to the gun. If there's any kind of a windage issue, you're kind of stuck with what you got.
That's true.
That's the big advantage with the elevation. I never found to be a big problem, but if the gun shot left or right, you're kind of, remember, they were put in the dovetail and staked in place.
Right, you can't move it.
So that was, and by the way, every one I ever shot with the original L sight, none of them shot to the sights.
Okay.
Yeah, so there was a reason why they went to this sight. I think the L's cooler looking from a historical prospect.
To me, it fits the role better. It's like, if you're giving this to cooks and drivers, you don't want them to be able to mess with things.
But again, we Americans have an obsession that rifles have to be target guns.
Yeah.
And boy, it follows. I mean, look at the M16A2 concept. Basically, the Marine Corps was given a chance to upgrade the gun, and they looked at it as a target rifle more than they looked at it as a combat weapon. So overall, I think carbine served well. If you look at all the vendors, for example, Inland made more than anybody else, and probably made the best quality guns.
Okay.
Now, back when I was a youngster, and these were our ARs, if you will. We didn't care about collectability. We didn't understand that. That wasn't a facet. We cared about function. And one of the things we learned early on, the Winchesters have a popular draw to the collectors because it's a Winchester. Quality-wise, they were not very good guns.
Okay.
I mean, the problems and stoppages and broken parts and stuff, because we were shooters, we kind of shied away from them. Inlands were the stars.
Okay. I was going to ask you that. Who would you go with?
Yeah, they were the stars of the guns. And if you read the history, the manufacturing process, a lot of the vendors had a lot of quality control problems.
Yes.
Now, I've got one of my favorite carbines is a Rockola, which I always figured, Rockola made jukeboxes. So a jukebox company making a carbine had to be a cool gun. And the one I've got is even cooler because it's a rebuild, like most GI guns were. And the cartouche on the stock, it was rebuilt at Ogden Arsenal, Ogden, Utah. It's an arsenal. And the inspector is, I think it's, I forget what his 3 initials were, but anyway, it's Elmer Keith, who was in charge.
Oh,
he was
that
the
is
head
super
inspector
cool.
at Ogden Arsenal in
Yeah.
that era. So I'm sure he never touched a gun, but I've got a jukebox-made carbine that was inspected by Elmer Keith when he was the chief technician in charge of the Ogden Arsenal.
That's very cool.
So it's a cool gun in that
Nice.
respect.
Absolutely.
But overall, I think the carbine, remember, and now if there's a lot of magazines coming in the country, the Korean ones that are being imported, the new ones.
A good magazine?
Good magazine.
Okay.
I've always felt that the 15 rounds were better, reliable magazines than the 30s. Saying that you load it to 30 rounds, you're asking for problems. Download it to about 25, 26, they tend to work better. It's just the way it is,
Okay. All right. Well, cool. Thank you very much for sharing some of your background expertise on these.
So when you get one, put a new recoil spring, get a Wolf spring.
New recoil spring.
And oil is your friend, Mike.
Lubricate the thing.
Yeah, and quality ammo.
Good ammo. All right.
Drive on.
Thanks for watching, guys.